everybody. Thank you for joining. I'm excited to be here to chat with Joah Spearman, who is the founder and CEO of Localeur. Joah is kind of like a hometown hero. I think everybody here in Austin kind of knows who he is. For those of you who don't know, Joah, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself for those of us who are not local, who don't know you, who should know you. So please introduce yourself and tell us about yourself and your journey as an entrepreneur thus far. Don't get too deep because I do have questions. So
sure thing. Well, first off, thank you so much, Min, and everyone at Capital Factory for hosting this. I think it's just an amazing endeavor that you're doing. I think it's even more impressive that you're doing this virtually amidst all the craziness of what's going on right now. So I think it's just phenomenal that you're doing this. Thank you, Sean, for doing this with me. For me, I have, I don't know if you can see it here, but this is the seal of the city of Austin tattooed on my inside left wrist. And the reason why I got that is because I moved to Austin when I was 18 as a freshman at UT Austin. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. And I really fell in love with Austin back then when I was in college, early 2000s. And even though I ended up starting my career, I moved to Washington, D.C. after college and became a speechwriter for a few years. But I moved back to Austin a little over 11 years ago now. And the sole reason I moved back was because I knew that Austin was a city that was very friendly for entrepreneurship, a great city to pursue business, basically. And so I moved back, left politics, and said, I'm going to start, my bold idea was that I was going to start a new business every year for 10 years until one of them clicked. So I had a sneaker boutique in downtown Austin. I started the first ever fashion part of South by Southwest Festival, ran that for a few years. I had a social media consulting agency with clients like FedEx and Deep Eddy Vodka, a lot of the bars on Rainy Street. And eventually through doing all that, what actually happened was it's not that I got an idea for a business, but that I was able to meet Heather Bruner and Brett Hurt. Heather is now the CEO and chairwoman of WP Engine. Brett Hurt is now the CEO, founder of Data.World. Before that, he was the CEO, founder of Bazaar Voice. So I met them back in late 2010. And thankfully, they saw something in me, saw potential in me, and they hired me. They recruited me and hired me at Bazaar Voice about a year before their IPO. So that kind of started really my journey in tech, because as a result of that, I was able to really bolster my network and understand kind of more about not just building a small business, but understanding how tech works. And so I was there for a little under 2 years, and then had this idea to start a company really out of this passion for travel and this idea that when I travel, I want to know where locals go. And I assumed that other people do too. So it started out in March 2013 with a dozen friends. And now here we are in 2020. We have locals in about 130 cities around the world, and have thankfully raised some money to do it.
Let me step back 1 second, because you said you made the conscious decision to move to Austin. And I just relocated to Austin less than a year ago. And when you tell people you're moving to Austin, I think one of the first things I've heard consistently is, why are you moving to Austin? Like, Austin isn't known for its diversity, blah, 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 blah. This is a Black in Tech summit. So can we talk a little bit about that decision? Maybe you were or were not an entrepreneur yet, but talk a little bit about that decision to move to Austin and what that means to you as a Black entrepreneur.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the important things that I understood about myself was that there were a lot of other cities that I felt were more attractive if I was looking for an industry that was a little bit more set in its ways, or looking for a city that had a lot more diversity, especially around, Black population. I could have moved to Atlanta, I could have moved to Chicago, New York, LA, any number of cities. But for me, when I moved back to Austin in early 2009, literally 5 days after Obama was inaugurated, I moved back. And for me, what I was looking for wasn't about demographics. What I was looking for was an ecosystem that was favorable to entrepreneurship. So I was willing, to me, to be an entrepreneur means you're going on a path that not many others are going. And so Austin in that way felt more attractive to me because it wasn't a city that relied on these kind of major Fortune 100 companies the way that, like Atlanta has Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines, State Farm Insurance, Chicago has a lot of big consumer products, good companies. New York has finance, fashion, media. LA obviously has entertainment. So most of the other cities, even at San Francisco, it's tech. So most other cities to me are very reliant on big employers in one industry or maybe two industries. Austin to me is a city of companies that employ between 5 and 50 people. And maybe there's a few companies that employ hundreds of people, maybe thousands. But Austin to me is a city where being an entrepreneur or having a small business is something that's very palatable regardless of demographics, regardless of ethnicity. I think it's a city that's welcoming to people with that mindset. So that's why I moved back here.
Awesome. That's a great answer. Let's talk a little bit about your journey as an entrepreneur. Did you always know you would be an entrepreneur? Is that something that came to you early in life or later in life? You've had quite a few businesses. So talk a little bit about what that drive represents for you.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it started, well, my grandmother would tell you that I wanted to be a business person since I was like 4 or 5 years old. I couldn't even say the word businessman, but when I was 4 years old, my grandmother would ask my two older brothers and I like what we wanted to be. And my brother, my oldest brother would say basketball player in the NBA. My middle brother would say like he wanted to be a producer like Dr. Dre or something like that. I would always say, I couldn't say the word, but I would say bending man. And so I would say some of it is probably innate, that somehow I got this early sense that business was something that you could pursue, but it really didn't become real to me until I was 12 years old. My mom, she was a kind of a secretary and administrative assistant most of her career. And she got a job as the assistant and the office assistant for a guy named Horace Williams. He was the first Black man that I ever knew who graduated from college and owned his own business. He owned a franchise of Pizza Huts in South Carolina. And as a part of a school project, I interviewed him to learn about how he started. And I ended up all through high school working at Pizza Hut. And just having the proximity to a Black man who was, college educated, had his own business, had a business card that said chief executive officer on it, it really made it real for me that was something that was attainable. Now, even at that time, though, I didn't know what entrepreneurship was, because even when I interviewed him, I didn't know to ask about entrepreneurship, so I didn't really understand entrepreneurship until probably college when, 2002, 3, 4, I'm pretty sure I was one of the first 40 or 50 people at University of Texas on Facebook. And I just remember seeing how like in a matter of like 6 weeks, Facebook just took over campus. And that's when I first, I think, started understanding that this thing, that you could do something and it could possibly have that kind of scale.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What was the inspiration for Localeur? Like, where did the idea come from? How did it take shape, and how did it also evolve as a business?
Yeah, so there's kind of 3 stages. I think the first stage is the inspiration is a combination of, like I said, I owned a sneaker boutique. So I owned a local business in downtown Austin, and like over 60% of my customers were travelers visiting Austin, walking around downtown. So I had this experience of serving a customer that was looking for a local kind of authentic thing that represented Austin, and they weren't going to the mall to look for it. And so I understood that customer in that way. And then the other part was, one of the benefits I had while I worked at Bazaar Voice for Brett Hurt and Heather Bruner was that I was able to move into a position where I was helping to shape their travel market strategy. So I was starting to be able to spend time with the clients such as Hilton or Marriott or the cruise ship companies, the airlines, and understand some of their pain points. And so that was the first part, is kind of combining having my experience of owning a local business and then the experience of working at Bazaar Voice. And then the second piece was my co-founder. I met him at Bazaar Voice, and he had this experience of wanting to have, he came to me and said, man, it would be so cool if there was a way where locals could share like where they go as well. So that was kind of the other piece. And then the third piece was, actually, he and I, once we kind of started thinking about the idea for a few weeks, we literally rented a room in Capital Factory. We rented a conference room for a weekend, and we pretty much locked ourselves in there for the full weekend. And we hashed out the business plan. We like whiteboarded it the whole weekend, just really testing assumptions, testing out what made sense, what didn't make sense. I brought in a friend to kind of serve as kind of like the judge if my co-founder and I kind of disagreed on something. And we came out of that 3-day weekend and pretty much had a fully formed business plan. I mean, obviously a lot of the assumptions ended up being wrong, but that 12 slide deck ended up resulting in me being able to comfortably go to the first set of investors and raise, I think we raised the first $150,000 even before Localeur existed. Localeur wasn't even in the name of the company, but it was off that 12 slide deck.
Did you have an MVP before you went out to raise?
No, I think now I think that the parameters of being able to raise are a lot different. So maybe you would need an MVP, but I would say at that time, I learned that because of the previous businesses I had, the sneaker boutique, the work with South by Southwest, the social media consulting company, I had this Rolodex of sorts of, let's say, 24 people who they were college professors, they were former bosses of mine, they were friends of friends, and I ended up writing a list down of 12 people, and those were the first 12 people that I personally was comfortable going to pitch. And I didn't care if they put in $5,000 or $50,000. I just wanted those 12 people to invest. So I got them all. I either met them in person or on the phone, and 8 of those 12 people ended up investing. So It was really the first people that I went after were really about credibility and the people that I had a certain rapport with from things I did professionally before.
So let's get into the meat of the story, because this is all about storytelling and gaining access to people outside of your network. If we can break it into a few different parts, talk a little bit about how important storytelling is for an entrepreneur. What are the critical elements of any story that an entrepreneur needs to tell?
So for me, what I've learned is that the most critical thing about storytelling, and this is just for me, certain companies, certain spaces have different tendencies, but for me, what I've realized having a travel focused, kind of consumer focused company is that I need to tell a story that relates to the investor or to the potential partner or whomever first as a traveler. So that way it reduces their inclination to believe that what I'm building isn't for them. So I start out by thinking about, okay, is this something that this person benefits from? So that addresses some of the why, like as to why should Localeur exist? And it's like, well, when you travel to Italy or to Japan or wherever you go, do you like going to the places where all the tourists are or where the locals are? And everyone inevitably answers where the locals are. And so then I say, okay, so where do you look for that online? And so the first part is relating to the person, whoever it is, whether it's an investor or partner. The second part is, for me, it's having a pretty high degree of, I would say there's a scale. And on the scale, on this side, there's control. And on this side, there is context. And you can't always control all the context about your industry. Like right now, the travel industry is obviously hurting as a result of COVID-19. So I can't control the context around travel, but what I can control is our perspective on what's happening and how it may potentially benefit us. So I think for me, one of the things that I've done in terms of storytelling is I've tried to be very transparent about what's going on in the industry, regardless of us. So I don't want my investors having their own opinions, to be honest, about what Wall Street Journal, New York Times is saying about Airbnb or TripAdvisor or Expedia or Booking.com or any big travel companies. I want to proactively use those big stories about those companies as a way to talk more and educate my investors about the space, because I wake up every day thinking about this industry. They don't. So I want to shape their point of view about the whole industry. So that's one of the big things I think about storytelling is understanding what you can control. So even if you can't control the context of your industry, you can control whether or not you can help shape the education and the information that your investors or your network is getting about the space.
So is the story then a similar story depending on, regardless of who you're talking to, or do you switch up that story depending on the audience? So there's story obviously that you're going to tell to your consumer or your customer, but then there's also the story that you will tell to a potential investor. I'm also assuming that there will be a difference in the story depending on what stage you're at. So can you expand a little more on that and how you did that specifically around Localeur?
Totally. So I'll just give you one very tangible example. The first real pitch meeting that I ever had for Localeur was about 2 weeks after we launched. So it was right after South by Southwest 2013, and I was able to pitch not Capital Factory, but CTAN. So I got invited to pitch Central Texas Angel Network. And at the time, to be completely honest, I was selling a rocket ship. I was selling, this is going to be TripAdvisor for the Airbnb generation. This is going to be a multi-billion-dollar company. That's what I feasibly thought at the time when we were a few weeks into our launch. Now, when I go to investors now, I don't tell them that. I am very practical. We've hired investment bankers. We've talked to potential acquirers. We have a really firm understanding of how much we could get bought for. So I don't want to lie to my investors and say we're going to get bought for billions of dollars when I've never heard that, right? So now I'm going with a much more transparent, kind of prudent story around say risk aversion. So when I pitch an investor now, I'm telling them, yes, you can go and invest this $25,000 in the next rocket ship, and maybe that'll happen. Maybe you have a 1 in 400 chance of that becoming a rocket ship. But with Localeur, that $25,000, maybe it doesn't turn into, maybe you're not going to get a 500x return, but I've more or less removed the bottom from Localeur's future. There's almost no scenario where Localeur will bottom out, run out of money, go out of business, go bankrupt, and be worth $0. But what we've done the last 7 years to validate our business plan, to generate revenue, to talk to the acquirers, to all those different things. And so now I'm going with a much different message. The message now is more around, hey, we know you're still going to take your shots and you go after your moon shots, your rockets, all that. But this is more about protecting your existing investment, or putting some money in a place where it's pretty safe. Maybe it's not as safe as like a money management account, or maybe it's not as safe as flipping some real estate. But it's by tech standards, we're very safe. So the story has changed a lot over the last 7 years.
How much have you raised so far?
So all in, we've raised about 5.2 million, of which my co-founder, he left the business he's coming up on about 4 years ago, and as a part of his exit, the company repurchased the majority of his shares. So we probably used several $100,000 to buy out his shares, just because it was he and I were 50-50 co-owners. And so when he decided to leave, we needed to both replenish the employee option pool and then also create more equity so that we could eventually raise more money from preferred shareholders, like, investors.
And that 5.2 million, was that outside of the traditional VC ecosystem, or was that a combination?
Yeah. So I would say the only official VC that is on my cap table is Arlen Hamilton with Backstage Capital. And then the next closest thing to a traditional VC would be Capital Factory, of which we were in their accelerator, and they contributed out of, I think it was Fund 4.
Was that a conscious decision on your part?
Yeah. So I spent 2 years of my life on planes flying to New York and San Francisco. My guess is I pitched somewhere between probably 95 different VC firms between San Francisco, New York, Austin, etc. So I pitched all the VC firms. And what happened is a couple of things. One, some of the VC firms were concerned about the space because they felt like, either TripAdvisor or Yelp or these companies already had a lot of the space, or in a lot of cases, some of the investors had invested in our competitors and those investments didn't prove out correctly. So, that we had a competitor called Y-Plan that was out of London. They raised about $38 million. We had a competitor called Soch out of San Francisco that raised about $18 million. And they had some very famous investors, very famous VC firms. Y-Plan ended up selling for about $2 million after raising 38. Soch ended up selling for, I think it was like $4 million after raising 18. So I think what it did is it scared the VC industry a lot about the space. And the VC industry didn't feel comfortable, I think, understanding how to pick the winners in this space. And so after about 2 or 3 years of banging my head against the wall, I decided to really pivot and focus on angels. So that's where I had already had angels invested, but at that point I said, you know what, I'm going after CTAN, I'm going after Houston Angel Network, I'm going after Cowtown Angels in Fort Worth, I'm going after Alamo Angels in San Antonio, Rio Grande Valley.
How did your narrative shift then? If you're not pitching VCs, obviously VCs, they're very focused on very specific things. How does that story then shift if you're speaking mostly to angels or first-time investors, perhaps?
Yeah, so I have a lot of first-time investors. So for first-time investors, the number one thing that I am selling to them is trust. So they are investing in the trust they have in me. So these people, some of my investors have known me since high school or college or when I was in DC in politics. So they don't necessarily know tech, they don't know startup investing, but these are these people with pretty high net worths. They may I have a guy who's a partner at PwC, the big accounting firm. I have 4 different people who are very high level in politics. One of them was the former head of communications for Hillary Clinton. One was the head of media for Bill Clinton. So they're not tech people, but they're very connected individuals, high net worth individuals. And so for me, what I'm really pitching to them isn't, hey, here are the unit economics, here are this and this and that. But I'm pitching to them, one, I am going to be transparent with you. So if you ask me a question, I will answer it. If you text me or you call me, I will answer it. So that's one. I think the second thing is I will help educate you on the industry, so you're not just walking in the dark. So again, that's where a lot of times I'll email my investors an email that has nothing to do with Localeur. Honestly, I'll say, here is a big story in the Wall Street Journal about Airbnb, and here's what I think about it. So they have a point of view on something that's happening in the industry, regardless of Localeur. So those are the 2 main things. Now, for experienced investors, what I was doing was going after credibility. So because I didn't have the VCs, I still wanted the networks. I still wanted the credibility. So I went after, so I have a group of 3 guys who they were early executives at Facebook. So they invested. I literally met them at a wedding. I met one of the guys at a wedding, and he ended up just randomly asking me what I did. I told him about it. He said, "Oh, wow, some friends of mine from Facebook, we do some angel investing. So send me a deck." I sent him a deck. And 5 weeks later, those guys invested. They became the largest investors I had at the time. The same thing. I blog a lot, so I blog on LinkedIn. I blog on Facebook. And the father of one of my former coworkers in DC, very successful Texas businessman. Oil leases, real estate, cattle, all these different traditional Texas businesses. He saw one of my blogs, and he reached out to me and asked me if I was fundraising, and I said yes. And he ended up, he ended up driving to Austin. We met, and he ended up becoming my lead investor. So, a lot of people I knew before. Yeah.
The question for you because you do blog a lot. You do share your thoughts far and wide. You're on LinkedIn. And I know founders who would say, I don't have time to do that. I'm running my company. How would you respond to that?
You know what? I see someone ask the question around introverted founders, so I almost want to loop the answer, bring that in as well. Mm-hmm. So for those who feel they don't have time and those who feel introverted, this is what I would challenge you to think about this. There is, name any company in the world. Every company, especially the best and the most known ones, they have a brand. And that brand is the story that people say about that brand, right? So Nike has a brand, and Nike isn't what Nike says it is all the time. Sometimes Nike is what other people say it is. So I think that what you have to understand is that telling a story about your company, your startup, is mission critical for being able to proactively shape the perspective that investors, potential partners, media, other people have about you and your business. So I would say it's, even in a lot of ways, I would say even before you hire a marketer, let's say that you're an engineer and you're like, I don't know how to market, and I need a marketer as a co-founder. That may be smart, But that doesn't mean that the marketer does 100% of the marketing. That may mean that what you need to do as an engineer is maybe you start a company engineering blog and you're talking about what you're doing. And that's helping to shape the perspective on the company that potential new hires are going to have. Right. So either way, I would say it's just mission critical to add storytelling to one of the fundamental things that you have to do in order to be the leader of not only your company, but the industry that you're trying to position your company in. So even though, Localeur is, most people outside of Austin, especially when I go to New York or I go to London or San Francisco, most people, they assume that Localeur has, I would say on average, people assume that Localeur has between 30 and 60 employees. And we have 3 employees. 3 employees. We've scaled from 1 to 131 cities globally with 3 people. And the reason why people assume that we're so much bigger than we are is because our brand is so much bigger than we are. Our brand, and that's material, because when I mentioned we talked to some potential acquirers, these companies, that's a lot of what they want to buy. They want to buy the cool factor in the brand that Localeur has. So that's a result of 7 years of storytelling.
That's true. That's true. If we can just, I don't know how much time we have left. So, Min, if you can jump in. No, I don't.
We've got about maybe time for one more question between you two, and then we can move into the Q&A.
Okay. So obviously, Localeur is a site that's structured around experiences and ostensibly travel. How are you adjusting in this new time of Corona/COVID-19? What adjustments have you had to make, and what does it look like, and how does that affect, the future of the company?
Two big things. One is, and my hope, some of my investors are probably saddened about this, but we ended 2019 very close to turning the corner on becoming cash flow positive and getting to profitability. This year, we were looking at ending the year probably somewhere between a 20 and 35% net margin. And as a result of COVID-19, what's happened is it's dramatically slowed down the pace of our revenue. It hasn't canceled the revenue, but it has slowed it down. For example, we work with Nike, and Nike, we were aggressively working on something with them in February through early March. And then as a result of this, they had to obviously close their factories in China and then slow down their supply chain. So as a result, they can't manufacture and sell shoes at the same rate they were before. Then they got to slow everything down. So that's a scenario where our revenue slowed down. So as a result, we're now going to raise a small bridge round, of which we're probably already about 2/3 of the way into raising. And that'll just allow us to be in a position where it'll offset, any funding needs we would have had this year that the revenue is not going to offset. So that's one, having to go back to put my fundraising hat back on instead of, focusing on being like the chief revenue officer for the company.
Did you start using that round before the whole Corona thing, or?
What I would say is I probably spent the first, I didn't want to go to my investors and raise money. So I wanted to wait and see what the government response was going to be. And if we got the PPP and SBA, which we haven't yet, still waiting to hear. So for me, the first probably 3 weeks, once the lockdown started, I spent the first 3 weeks cutting expenses. So we probably cut our burn. Everyone took a pay cut. We cut so many expenses. So we probably cut our burn by about 28 to 30% within 3 weeks. So the first thing I wanted to tell the investors is we're cutting expenses. So we've done our part. So now I need you to do your part, which is, add another, $25,000 or whatever it is that they're going to put in. So that was one of the main things. And then the second thing that I've done is really, thankfully, anticipating that travel was not going to be the only way for us to generate income. Even before this started, we started somewhat pivoting our revenue and focusing more and more on brands outside of travel. So I mentioned Nike is one. Last year, we partnered with Match.com. So we're trying to get more and more into partnerships that don't rely solely on travel behavior. And we realized that because we have this global community now in 130 plus cities, and they're not just traveling, maybe they travel 4, 5, 6 times a year, but the other 200 and something, 300 days a year, their home, they're buying beauty products, they're buying shoes, they're wearing clothes, they're going to work. So there are all kinds of other things that they have insight on that we're going to start expanding our partnerships to uncover.
So you definitely see a life for Localeur, even in the face of this.
Yeah, thankfully, none of our revenue. We had a really big partnership with JetBlue Airways for several years, and we proactively decided to end that partnership. It was a pretty large portion of our revenue in 2019. And probably the first email I sent my investors this year was that we're not going to work with JetBlue anymore, because we had an exclusivity clause with them, and it no longer felt right to give them exclusivity for something that we felt like we were in position to sell to a number of different brands. So that's something that we started doing, and thankfully that making that move was a tough move on our balance sheet at the time, but it made us even less reliant on travel itself.
Great.